Welcome, everyone. So glad to see you here today. And we'll be praying for you guys over there in England, etc., trying to witness to Muslims that the Lord will protect you and that maybe someone will have a change of heart. Um, and we'll pray for your protection. Today, we're continuing on in our study of Esther. It's Esther 5:9 through 6:14. And the title of today's lesson is The Tables Are Turned. But in our last lesson, the Jews throughout the kingdom of the Medes and Persians were in mourning. They had read the edict that Haman had persuaded the king to write, and it was the death sentence of all Jews in the kingdom. Esther, because she was sheltered in the palace, didn't know about the edict. When she heard about Mordecai being clothed in sackcloth, she sent Hathach out to find out what was wrong. Mordecai sent a copy of the edict with Hathach to show Esther and also told him to tell her that she needed to ask the king for mercy. Esther sent word back that since she had not been summoned by Ahasuerus, she might be executed if she appeared before him. To this, Mordecai replied that it was her duty to try to help her people, and God would punish her and her family if she didn't. Esther agreed to go see the king, saying, "If I perish, I perish." But when she went to the king, he extended his golden scepter and accepted her, asking her what she wanted of him. Wisely biding her time, she said that she wanted the king and Haman to attend a banquet she had prepared. At the banquet, Esther again postponed confronting Haman and invited them both to another banquet the following day. And so we read on in Esther 5:9 through 14. Then Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house. But he sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of the glory of his riches and of his many sons, and every occasion on which the king had honored him, and how he had promoted him above the officials and servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one except me come with the king to the banquet which she has prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her with the king." Yet all this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, "Have a wooden gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet." And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the wooden gallows made. Figuring that he was the favorite of both the king and the queen, Haman went home that day in high spirits until he saw Mordecai at the king's gate. He thought that surely Mordecai would now bow to him out of fear, since he'd read the edict and knew that Haman was behind it. When Mordecai neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, Haman's joy turned to rage. Proverbs 14:17 says, "A quick-tempered person acts foolishly, and a person of evil devices is hated." However, he restrained himself from harming Mordecai and went home. At home, he gathered his wife and friends to brag about himself, his wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him above the other nobles and officials. And then there was the top honor. Only he had been invited to the banquet of the queen for the king and him, and she had invited him again for the next day. Foolish man! Little did he know that the noose was tightening around his own neck. The God who was listening to his boast was preparing a humbling party for him. Then Haman told his wife and friends and all that he had given him no satisfaction or happiness as long as he saw Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate, refusing to bow to him. I guess it wasn't enough that he'd already condemned Mordecai and all the rest of the Jews to death. Haman's anti Semitism and hatred of Mordecai and the Jews obviously came to him directly from Satan, who bitterly hates God's people. By the way, that's where all the current anti Semitism is coming from. But Haman didn't realize that he was on thin ice when he determined to wipe out God's beloved. Haman's wife and friends tried to make him feel better. They told him he could assuage his hurt pride and anger by building a 75-foot gallows. That's the height of an 8-story building. Why did it have to be so high? Haman wanted Mordecai's body to be seen for miles so that he would get his revenge. The friends told him to ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hung on it, and then go to the queen's dinner happy. So that night, Haman had the gallows built, never guessing who would actually be hanging on it. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before humbling." Reading on in Esther 6:1-9, it says, "During the night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had reported about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's units, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to attack King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, 'What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' And the king's servants who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.' So the king said, 'Who is in the courtyard?' Now Haman had just entered the outer courtyard of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the wooden gallows which he had prepared for him. So the king's servant said to him, 'Behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard.' And the king said, 'Have him come in.' Haman then came in, and the king said to him, 'What's to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?' Therefore Haman said to the king, 'For the man whom the king desires to honor, have them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal turban has been placed. Then order them to hand the robe and the horse over to one of the king's noble officials, and have them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, so it shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Now, in this chapter, we see the hand of God at work in the lives of unsuspecting people who never intended to do God's will. God moves in them to accomplish what he wants. In doing it, God honors his faithful children. During the night in which Haman was having the gallows made, the king couldn't sleep. Sometimes God causes insomnia to deliver his messages to people too busy to listen during the day. A point would be Daniel 2:1. Now the second year in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Some people, when they can't sleep, get up and read. So Ahasuerus got up and ordered the book of the Chronicles to be read to him. In this book, the record of events in his reign was recorded. While the person was reading and the king was listening, they came across a record of how Mordecai had exposed the two officers of the king who had conspired to assassinate him. Esther 2:22-23 says, "But the plot made known to Mordecai, and he became known to Mordecai, and he informed the queen, Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. Then, when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a wooden gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence." With all the circumstances arranged by God, the king's heart in the palm of his hand, it was easy for King Xerxes to find Mordecai's name in the record. The king recognized at once that here was the record of a man who had saved his life, but he received no recognition or reward for doing it. It was a great oversight on the king's part, and he realized how negligent he'd been. Was it just a coincidence that caused the king to have a sleepless night on this night when Mordecai's gallows were being built? Was it just a coincidence that the king read about Mordecai in the Chronicles? Remember that Haman had planned that day to be the day of Mordecai's execution. The king asked his attendants what honor and recognition had been given to Mordecai for his faithfulness in saving the king's life. They affirmed his memory that nothing had been done for Mordecai. Was it just coincidence that at that moment Haman appeared, intending to request that Mordecai be hanged on his gallows? Wow. There are no coincidences with the Lord. He is at work in his world, moving even his enemies to do his will. Let's never forget that. The king asked who was in the court. It turned out to be Haman, who never did get the chance to open his mouth and with his request about Mordecai's execution. He probably had his arguments ready to convince the king that Mordecai was the worst of those hated enemies, the Jews. He would get the king to say that Mordecai must die in the morning. His pride assured him that the king would do anything he asked. How could he lose? But he didn't count on the great personal lord and friend of Esther, Mordecai and the Jews. Psalms 2:4 says, "He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them." The Lord was about to laugh out loud at the expression in Haman's face and the bursting of his balloon of pride. Ahasuerus was looking for someone to give him ideas about how to honor Mordecai. When he saw Haman, he thought, he always has good ideas. So without mentioning the name of the man he was talking about, he asked Haman what he should do for the man whom the king delights to honor. Pride goes before a fall, and Haman's pride led him right into the trap. How he regretted it later. In his pride, Haman thought that surely he must be the man whom the king wanted to honor. He thought, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So Haman's suggestions were all made with himself in mind. What could he be like? What would he like the king to do for him? Well, he wanted to be one of the king. He wanted one of the king's royal robes put on him. He wanted to have the king's horse to ride with the royal crest on its head. He suggested that the robe and the horse be given to one of the king's most noble princes. The noble prince would then lead the horse through the city streets. Then he wanted the prince who was leading the horse to proclaim before him, "This is what's done for the man the king delights to honor." We can only imagine the swelling of Haman's pride as he thought about his great honor that would come to him. However, let's read on. Esther 6:10 through 14. Then the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the robe and the horse, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fail to do anything of all you have said." So Haman took the robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "So it shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. And Haman informed Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends of everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not prevail over him, but will certainly fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Haman's huge bubble of pride burst the next minute when the king said, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Don't neglect anything you've recommended." Haman had built the trap. Now he was caught in it. Of course, he had no choice. He had to do what the king said. He could hardly try to get the king to execute Mordecai when he wanted to honor him. So Haman was confronted with his humiliating task. He must honor Mordecai, whom he hated, who was a Jew, whom he hated, who sat when he should have bowed to him. Outside Haman's house stood a 75-foot gallows on which Mordecai should be hanging this morning. Instead, Mordecai is in the king's robe, seated on the king's horse, being led through the streets by his greatest enemy, Haman, who was proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." God has said that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be honored. Here's a perfect example of both. We read in Proverbs 29:23, "A person's pride will bring him low, but a humble spirit will obtain honor." After this, Mordecai humbly returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home, sick to his stomach and with his head covered in grief. Maybe he covered his head with a scarf or something to show his grief. 2 Samuel 15:30 says, "And David was going up the ascent of Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, and his head was covered, and he was walking barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his own head, and they were going up, weeping as they went." Now his story was quite different from the one he boasted about the night before. When he told his wife and advisors what had happened, they made a very astute observation. They could see that Haman's downfall had started before Mordecai in this strange turn of events. They said that since Mordecai was a Jew, Haman would not be able to stand against him, but would come to ruin. They actually seemed to have fear of the Jews and some understanding of their special protection and blessing from God. What did they know about the Jews that made them come to this conclusion? Well, you know what? They must have heard stories about how the God of the Jews had rescued them and fought against their enemies. That must have been a scary prediction for Haman to hear, and from his wife and friends. But it was God's truth coming from the mouth of pagans. It only took a few hours before their entire prophecy was fulfilled. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs came to hurry Haman away to Esther's banquet. Well, in conclusion, in his book, Esther, a Woman of Strength and Dignity, Chuck Swindoll stated several important principles that apply to this entire episode involving Haman and Mordecai and apply to our lives as well. Number one, when all seems lost, it isn't. Mordecai was facing the impossible situation, his death and the death of all the Jews in the kingdom. Could it get any worse? Yes, actually, it did get worse, as Haman had his gallows built for Mordecai's execution the next day. Does it sometimes seem like things can't get any worse? But all is not lost when we're on God's side. Number two, when no one seems to notice, they do. Mordecai had courageously reported the attempt on the king's life, but no one seemed to notice what he'd done, except that the two conspirators were executed. Mordecai was ignored, but God had not forgotten. Hebrews 6:10. Just as Mordecai's faithful act had been recorded in the king's chronicles, so what we do for God is recorded by him. Possibly no one else notices or appreciates what we do, but God keeps track, and it will all come out sooner or later. Number three, when everything seems great, it's not. Haman thought that he was on top of the world. He was a personal friend of the king and queen. He had planned his revenge against the Jews who had killed his people long ago. He would see his personal enemy, Mordecai, hanged on a giant gallows. In his pride and selfishness, he had everything going his way. Then God stepped in and turned the tables. We must be careful not to live selfish, hateful lives. And accounting will come. Proverbs 28:18 says, one who walks blamelessly will receive help, but one who's crooked will fall all at once. And number four, when nothing seems just, it is. Mordecai had been honored by the king, but he didn't demand a high position. He humbly returned to his place at the king's gate. His time of exaltation would come later. God had promised blessing and cursing depending on how the Jews were treated. Genesis 12, 2 through 3 says this, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. God's justice would prevail. We may not find justice in this world, but we will find it for sure in God's eternal home. And number five, when God seems absent, he's present. This whole story is proof of this point. I heard a story about a man who was shipwrecked on an uninhabited island. He carefully built a little hut for shelter and put everything in it that he had salvaged from the shipwreck. One day when he came back from looking for food, he saw his little hut in flames. He had nothing left and was brokenhearted. The next morning when he woke up, he found a ship anchored off the island. The first ship he had seen in all those weeks he had been there. The captain told him, we saw your smoke signal and came to rescue you. Sometimes what we think is the worst thing that can happen turns out to be the best in God's plan. He doesn't turn his back on those who love his son. Wow, what a story, huh? So amazing. It's some really good reminders about how the Lord takes care of us. He's not going to let us suffer defeat. He's not going to let these evil people win. When I reread this the study